morning, Matthias. Welcome to Career Conversations. Thank you for joining us today. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
My name is Matthias Ciappara. I'm a gamification and player engagement specialist. I've focused mainly on the product side, kind of designing gamification ecosystems and products across both the B2B and the B2C space. So my main focus is how to add more entertainment value to products aside from just the core mechanics. So both from a B2B perspective, I started as a product manager at Swint, where we focused on creating promotional mechanics like tournaments, challenges, and missions on top of the studio's content. And then moving on into multiple consultancy gigs. And also one of my largest roles was at Entain. Started off as the head of gaming innovation, then director of gaming innovation at the end there, where I was focused on kind of creating an ecosystem of promotional mechanics that sit on top of pretty much every product vertical on the space. My main kind of focus is both on the backend mechanics as well as the operational side, as well as kind of the customer experience. But my kind of passion is mostly on what the customer sees and how we get more entertainment from that perspective. Most recently, I've had also a bit of a personal passion project for me, where I currently wrote and authored a book which will be releasing next year called It's All a Fucking Facade, which is essentially a psychology and philosophy book, but it's written in a way where it's a more conversational style and can be understood from a Main Street perspective.
Okay, wow. That was a long one. Okay. I was going to ask you, how did you get started in the gambling industry, but you already took us through it. All right. Let's delve into the gamification. Okay. Just tell us, like in your version in simple terms, what is gamification?
So I think it's mainly about adding small elements to the experience to make it more entertaining or more fun. I mean, ultimately what we're doing is pretty much taking things that we do in everyday life to make things more exciting. For example, let's say if I have a book or a TV show which has a cliffhanger at the end, that's essentially the same thing as having a small mechanic that is kind of promoting the player to come back on a second time. For example, most of these mechanics are essentially focused on the dopamine system by essentially giving extrinsic motivation to kind of keep players coming back to the brand or the product, and also to kind of make it more engaging. Now, essentially, our dopamine system as humans is kind of based on the fact that, let's say we have made a goal, and the goal is to grow potatoes or grow tomatoes, for example. Now, every time we hit a milestone, let's say we got our seeds, the seeds started sprouting. Every time that we reach a milestone, which is towards, I'm going to have a tomato at the end, our brain naturally releases dopamine. This essentially is how our intrinsic motivational cycle works. Now here, it's essentially based on we have a goal, and every time that we're reaching a milestone to that goal, we're getting dopamine. Now, what we're doing, essentially gamification, is kind of identifying things that are these milestone mechanics that kind of make things more engaging or more fun or release dopamine intrinsically and be able to kind of create them into an actual product. Essentially, it is about identifying different mechanics that we can add that are able to kind of take advantage of the intrinsic motivational cycle. So dopamine essentially is our kind of motivational hormone to some extent.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. Okay. So if we're thinking about the gamification role in like from an operator side, in which department does the person sit?
So usually it's mainly between product, commercial, and operations. So most of the time it's a bit of mixture of all of them. So you do need tools to be able to kind of create these mechanics. So from my side, I mostly focused on the product side. But essentially, it's creating tools and mechanics that then, for example, the casino team, CRM team, or operations team are able to operate. Obviously, you are sitting in between pretty much every department from tech, product, design, because it kind of requires work from all departments to be able to kind of create the final product or the final ecosystem. Same thing regarding on if we're creating a product, any mechanic in reality, this needs to be then also promoted from the CRM perspective. So the department itself kind of sits in the middle of pretty much every department, aside from payments usually, but pretty much it's kind of sitting across all kind of commission operations side and the product side.
Yes, okay, that makes sense. It's product, but it needs support from a lot of different departments. And what is the main number one KPI for the role?
So I think generally, obviously, our main focus point is going to be increasing customer lifetime value, right? That's the ultimate goal, is to improve how much revenue per user these products create and keeping the players retained for longer. But ultimately, I think our main focus point as a gamification is actually keeping players focused. So I think one of the most important parts which is just not just us within the iGaming industry, but also as in App Store games in general. One of the main parts is how to keep people focused. So the more you're able to keep players focused on your game or product, essentially session time, the more revenue you generate. And nowadays, especially on mobile, everything is trying to take your attention away. So the more keeping players focused for 30 seconds longer is incredibly difficult, because ultimately nowadays you're getting emails, LinkedIn, something is constantly trying to take your attention away. And because anything in your phone, you can come back to it at any time, you don't have to focus. So keeping people focused is very, very difficult. So the more you can keep players focused on your product, the more you kind of overall LTV you can generate later on. Once the player has logged in, how do you make sure the player doesn't leave for a certain amount of minutes? How do you keep them focused? That's the main kind of element there.
With the progress bars and
Could be progress bars, tournaments, loyalty mechanics, something that you have to unlock, some other thing that you're collecting and you need to collect something to, let's say you're adding a collection mechanism where you have let's say, for example, you're doing an Easter mechanic where you're collecting a special type of experience points or coins. And so you kind of, if you reach, let's say you get 30 more coins, this particular session, you're going to get another, let's say, key. The key can unlock something else. So you have something that there's two parts. You have firstly making sure you have stored value. So on the brand, you have something ready to unlock. So you have a reason to come back next time. But secondly is that you have something which you're in progress or in flight with. And so it doesn't make sense for you to leave the game or leave the session. So it's how do you keep players invested in that particular session by having something that they're going to unlock, win, or to collect, essentially.
okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Trying to understand what the role would look like, the day-to-day of a gamification product owner.
Okay. So I think it depends on the seniority. So firstly, it's making sure, firstly, you have to have the overlying vision and roadmap structured, right? So once that is there, then it's making sure that each individual team, and from the backend teams and the front end teams and the design teams, all kind of know what needs to be done. There's multiple, because it sits in the middle of multiple departments. There is usually a lot of project management between all the different departments to make sure everything from a product side is being done. And there's things like compliance, making sure that all of these mechanics will have different regulatory requirements per jurisdiction being operated in. So this kind of adds a lot of complexity there. And then also on the operational side. So how are these mechanics going to be operated? Both from the operations team who's actually setting up the promotions, making sure also that the things, there's no leeway of mistakes of how these products are being operated. They do have a large potential of bonus cost. So it needs to be kind of balanced out. There's not too much value being pushed out. So essentially like QAing templates and things like that. And then also from that side is how do you manage customer service queries? So then it's also kind of making sure that from a type of operational side, everything is managed. So it's a mixture of backlog grooming, making sure the design team is briefed, creating new tickets, new requirements, but also kind of making sure that everything kind of coincides in the same kind of vision, because all of these mechanics do have to operate with each other. So what I really don't like is when you have mechanics that are kind of completely siloed. And so the player then has to choose between one product or another. And that always kind of creates this fear of missing out, which is something you don't really want in customers. So how do you make sure all of these mechanics are able to kind of create a cohesive ecosystem of products rather than being siloed in the visual promotional mechanics, let's say that way.
Okay. So if somebody wanted to move into this role, what skills would you say that they need to get?
So I think firstly is kind of understanding, let's say, the principles of gamification. There are some good frameworks from UKHO, for example, that you can use just to understand the principles of what's there. Also understanding App Store games, they are amazing of doing gamification. So playing on them and being able to understand how other industries, because gamification is mostly used in video games, like weird enough. So like that's why I kind of go away from the definition of gamification, because it says the use of game design elements in a non-gaming environment, but it's mostly used in video games. So it's massively used in a gaming environment anyway. And then from that, you can start understanding the psychology behind what drives gamification, which also helps you kind of design products. But I think also it's having a very, very good understanding of the user experience or the principles of user experience. So for example, making sure that whenever you're designing any product, for example, one pet peeve of mine is when you start putting splash screens. I really hate them because you're kind of interrupting the player session or the player flow. And having a very, very good understanding of what product it's being embedded on, and also how users interact with that product and what they're looking for properly. So understanding gamification is one thing, but obviously then applying it to the product, you have to understand the casino, for example. You have to understand how players interact with casino first, what are they looking for, and how do they behave. And then you can easily more kind of understand what mechanics to add on them. So having a good understanding of the actual underlying product and how players behave on a product is a massive important thing, because then it makes it easier to understand how to implement these mechanics.
Yeah. Okay. So it's for someone in customer support to move into the team, in a junior role.
I think, you need to have it's good to have a very good understanding of, let's say, customer service roles, right? But then you need to understand a bit more of, let's say, if you go, because it is mainly a product role, user experience design. So how are products well designed, and how do you create a flow? And then product management. And there's a lot of courses now in product management of understanding how the product life cycle is done, how products are built, understanding behavior, and then understanding principles and mechanics kind of from the gamification perspective. So there's kind of a lot of aspects you have to learn, but really understanding the player behavior on the product is really important in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. And when hiring for your team, okay, especially in the tech or product roles, what do you look for to make sure projects get delivered?
So it's from our product side perspective, right? It's having a good understanding of product, having worked in product before, especially again on the product that is being deployed on. So if, for example, are doing gamification on casino, had a good casino experience and background, understanding how margin works, understanding how the overall, how if you're creating any mechanic, how the numbers run. Because ultimately, whatever we're creating, you need to make sure that it is reasonably from a profitability perspective, right? And both in making sure, let's say, if you're giving an ask, is the ask reasonable for the player, first of all, depending on different segments. So, because obviously when you're designing a mechanic, you have to make sure that it's not something where it's only specifically for the VIPs, unless you're a really big company and can afford to make VIP only mechanics. But then also, for example, making sure that the recreational audience is able to interact with it, and then having a good understanding of our experience in product and user experience. So I do kind of focus a lot on the user experience aspects of it. On a technical part, I usually, from my side, don't really recruit that much in tech, because usually the technology department perspective. But I think it's more making sure that you have a bit of a balance between more senior engineers and more mid-level and junior engineers in the team. So you can kind of have a bit of a balance of who is actually able to mentor the junior staff and things like that. So it's more having a bit of a balance depending on the seniority of staff and kind of what they have worked on before, and making sure that it's a bit balanced well in the team.
When you're working in casino, right, every month they have promotions, and there's usually a monthly promotional plan, which is done ahead. Who decides the promotions?
Yes, I think it depends on which company I've worked with. So for the last, for example, Entain and the last company I've worked with, Competition Labs, it was most on the product side. So for example, at Entain, there's a central product unit which creates the products for, and then the different commercial market, and then they're operating it in. Obviously, from a product side, before you design the product, you do have to design promotions. So if you're, let's say, designing a loyalty mechanic, you do have to create let's say, how much do players have to play to get this? You do still have to design that. And because that is, I think it's an inherent part of the product. If you cannot model things and promotions on Excel sheet and make sure the numbers make sense from both the commercial side and also the player perspective, the product isn't going to work anyway. So it depends on kind of the company and how they operate in. Sometimes the smaller companies, they will have more of a smaller team which operates and does the product side, whilst larger companies may have more of a product unit which creates a tool set for then the commercial unit. Also, before I used to work as a B2B as well, provider as well. So there I kind of focused more on the product side and how do we create tools for the operators to use. But you do have to make sure that you do understand very well how the promotions will be run. So you do have to balance it out, right? Because if you create a loyalty mechanic, but it doesn't, let's say, only a small cohort of your segments can actually operate it in, it's not really doing anything for most of your players. So before you start designing the product per se, kind of you need to have already a good understanding of how it will be used in the end goal as well.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for explaining that. So now this brings me on to my next question, right? There's going to be a lot of collaboration between teams. Maybe you can share some tips.
But from my side, it's a difficulty, right? Like, because you need to get buy-in from pretty much every department to some extent. I think the best I found to be very effective is making sure that first you have a product vision which is set in a deck, or I like presentations because I like that personally, where everyone can be kind of aligned on what we're actually building or what the actual vision is. Because then once every department understands kind of, some people don't care, some people do, but everyone's people kind of understand what we're trying to achieve and the why we're trying to achieve something, it makes it easier then to be able to kind of push those tasks. Like if you come in with random tasks without the individuals understanding the whole ecosystem you're trying to build, it makes it more difficult to sell. I mean, part of product is always going to be sales because you have to sell your ideas to the commercial stakeholders, to get budgeting, to the developers. You're pretty much selling the idea to pretty much anyone. So having a cohesive strategy and vision that you're able to kind of share with all of the different teams and explain to them the why behind it, I found it to be quite effective. And then being able to kind of make sure that how then the different tasks are made is making sure that they're kind of first communicated in a way that it's easy for the team to understand. So making sure that the way you're communicating is kind of knowing your audience to some extent, making sure that you're kind of making the tasks, how they're created, they're kind of more, let's say it, tweaked to some extent on the different department that you're speaking with. Technology cares more about certain things. Design will care only about certain things. So there's something that sometimes I struggle with personally, I'm not going to lie, because sometimes it's a bit difficult because I get too excited about the product aspect, but it's kind of making sure that each department gets kind of their own unique kind of interpretation, the requirements, documentation based on how their workflow is. Also making sure that kind of, as much as possible, there's two parts. Firstly is integrating into their own process and workflow. So they have a certain way of how they like to work and how their processes work is you have an understanding of how they work and you kind of try to adhere to them. You're essentially adding more workload to them. So obviously making sure that, like, let's say the tasks are given in a certain way, in the way that they like them, in a certain process that they like, is going to make less headaches. On the other side, let's say, for example, if you're working with a team like design, making sure that they understand what you're trying to achieve, but then leaving them leeway on how they should achieve it. Because you're not there to dictate, I'm not a designer. I'm very good at UX experience design, but ultimately you ask me the design team because they're better at design and they're the ultimate design stakeholder. So making sure that you leave a lot of leeway and be able to utilize their expertise as much as possible. So it's a bit of a mix between having a task of this is what I need done, but also like how do you see this being done in the best way possible? Because then it needs to be a proper collaboration, essentially, between all the different departments. That seems to help quite easily, usually.
Excellent. Let's move on to tools of the trade. So what are the top 3 tools or platforms, software that you use all the time?
So it can be a bit personal, for example, right? Like, so first it depends on the company you're working with and what processes they have. So some companies already have a technology process where they're using Jira, they're using Confluence. Some may use Waterfall, may use different tools. So firstly, there is basic project management tools. This could be Confluence, Jira combo, which have right now. There's also now Monday.com and there's Asana. I have used Asana recently, which is quite much easier in terms of the user experience. Excel, like that's just like, modeling is always done in Excel before you start doing anything. Then it comes to wireframing or user experience. I really love Miro, but that's like a personal thing because Miro helps me do user like experience very easily. It helps you do wireframes very easily. It helps you also do flowcharts very, very easily because it connects one box to another with one click. So it makes it very easy to create very, very complex trees without having to play around. Some people use Figma or FigJam. I tend to prefer Miro personally. It's just more of an ease of use kind of product rather than being like one of them is better than the other. It's more of a personal preference. But from a user experience or sort of like wireframing kind of element, I tend to prefer Miro. But you can use other products like Figma pretty much as well.
Okay. So let's move on to working remotely. Since you need to collaborate, we've discussed that in the role, you need to collaborate with a lot of different departments. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on working remotely?
I like it, like some extent, right? Like, but I think there's limitations. So I've worked with remote where most of my team were dotted around the planet. It works. But I think that you need to make sure that firstly, there's enough collaboration between the team to make it. Sometimes remote can lose the human touch of it. So if you're working remote, needs to have a very, very, very good alignment on what is we're doing. So again, vision and the overall needs to be fully aligned. Everyone needs to understand that very well. And then making sure that everyone understands what they're doing. So like, this is your task, when it's going to get delivered, things like that. But that's just the base of remote working. But I think sometimes it can lose the human touch. So making sure that that is really kind of balanced out. Also, some things are much easier on a whiteboard. So I still prefer that there's a certain amount of people being meeting in person, because sometimes on a whiteboard you can get done something faster than 15 minutes than having to do it online. Same thing, it also kind of makes it a lot faster than having to write a document and then having to go on Miro, make 15 flowcharts to explain something basic, which could be explained in 2 minutes on a piece of paper. So sometimes there is benefits of being in person. And also I think having a hybrid element, or as if your team is not in the same country, making sure that you are actually meeting with the team and actually having some amount of time with them, not just being a pure remote. I think that's pure remote to some extent. It depends on the individuals. I know some people that just want to work only remote, but it can also get quite isolated as well. So I think sometimes having that kind of personal interaction is quite important as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the ethics part of gamification. Our society is getting less attentive and more impatient. From your perspective, how healthy is gamification and iGaming?
So look, I mean, ultimately what we are doing is it's pretty much hijacking the natural dopamine system, right? Like, I don't think that gamification in use in iGaming is any different than the games themselves. Like, ultimately, both of them are interacting with the dopamine system. I think my largest issue isn't when gamification is used in iGaming, but it's when it's not used in iGaming. Because, or for example, let's say social media platforms where you have TikTok Reels, which operate the exact same way as a slot machine, and the same mechanics are being used in social media to increase engagement, or other apps to increase engagement. And because with gambling, there is a cost, right? So in our minds, if I go in and I deposit 50 euro and I play, I lost 50 euro. So there's a cost element to me gambling. When it comes to any other app store game or social media, there is zero cost. And when it comes to zero cost or free, our brain tends to go kind of wonky on calculating what we're actually losing, because it's free, even though we're losing an insane amount of time and attention and our natural dopamine. I think in general, the more engagement mechanics we add to our phones, the more it's going to impact negatively our overall mental well-being. This is kind of one of the reasons why I actually ended up writing the book, It's All a Fucking Facade, and kind of starting off that kind of side project I have, because essentially we're kind of creating so much external stimulation that it's kind of really interfering with how we perceive real life. Because let's using the same example I used earlier of I'm growing tomatoes, which is how our natural dopamine system works. Between me seeing the seed sprout and me seeing the plant start to grow, there is 3 weeks. So our natural dopamine system, between milestones, it has a very long period of waiting, which nothing is really happening. Now, before, there was nothing really happening in life when we didn't have phones, so that was fine. But the problem nowadays is because every time we have a slight second which we're bored, we open our phone and we have 15 or 16 different sources of dopamine. And the problem that creates is that then natural dopamine releases for me doing a hobby or things like that feel flat, because compared to the highly specialized engagement mechanics we have, they're never going to compete. So what it's causing is that then the normal things or the normal things we do in our life start to feel flat in comparison to how much engagement we're getting through our phone. Also, because there is so many constantly bombarding us, which one do you choose? Because on your phone, you now have someone on LinkedIn, you have emails, you have 15 games and notifications, you have posted a photo which is now getting X amount, and it's your X amount of likes and engagement. It's your best one ever, which is gamification to some extent from a psychology perspective. And this is causing where our attention span across the board is going down by 30 seconds per year. Insane. That's through App Store data. So our attention span is continuously dropping. And the problem is that when we're constantly expecting our dopamine to be at a certain level, every time it dips, it creates us to freak out, because that's why we're constantly looking at our phone, constantly waiting for our phone to ring, kind of like Pavlov's dog to some extent. And so it's kind of really interfering with what we enjoy in our life. I don't think this is an issue regarding gamification and iGaming, because iGaming has a cost to it and there's a limitation with regulation and things like that. But I think it's generally like how engagement mechanics are utilized on mobile in general. And I think when the app is free, it's even worse, because our brain doesn't compute it. Our brain really struggles when it comes to zero cost, essentially. Like there is no cost to it, even though we wasted 4 hours of our day on that. So I think in general, especially with gamification, when can be used in a certain way, can be incredibly effective, let's say in learning or things like that to make people learn more. But again, it also has, you have to be very careful on balancing it out. So for example, if I'm looking at Duolingo, or products where they're using gamification to, let's say, push education, it's making sure that the point is to push players or push the user to start getting into a habit of learning through gamification, but then letting the intrinsic motivational cycle kick in to keep them learning, not making the extrinsic motivation of Duolingo the actual product of why you learn. Because then you're not really learning, you're just there to play the game in a different language. So I think gamification can be an incredibly effective tool set, can be used wrongly in some cases, especially when it's not in gambling, but obviously also in gambling from the perspective. But I think that it can also be as effectively helpful as it can be. It can also be quite destructive. So it needs to be balanced out with some good ethics as well.
Yeah. Okay. That was an in-depth.
Yeah. Quite, that's one of the reasons I ended up writing the book and kind of pushing on this, because I think we're really screwing up kind of, especially when it comes to lots of kids. It's like social media reels, when you're swiping up and you're not sure if your next video is positive or negative. This means you're not sure if the next video you're going to like it or not. If you only liked the videos you saw, you wouldn't like Instagram reels that much or TikTok. But because you get videos which are a bit like, what the fuck did I just watch? It becomes more engaging. Same with slots, where you're not sure if you're going to win or not. And there's that small period between I am not sure what's coming next, which is like a spin, which essentially hijacks the same, I call it zone of uncertainty, as slot machines do. And it's now so prevalent where people are using 1.5 hours of reels a day. Same with YouTube shorts. That's completely killing our attention span. It's causing us lots of issues, and especially with children, because now that instant gratification, constant we want, is really impacting of how we look at things in life. So it is, I think, long term, we need to be careful on how we are utilizing these mechanics, because they will start causing issues with people in the air.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about your book? When is
Sure.
it launching? What is the name? You mentioned already, but tell us again.
So the book, it's called It's All a Fucking Facade. And it's the raw journey about to break life solutions and find true meaning. It started kind of a passion project from mine. The illusions that you're trying to break are ones which are self-imposed. So the premise of the book is question everything, especially your own bullshit, because we're really, really good at lying to ourselves. And essentially a blend of 7 academic principles from psychology, philosophy, sociology, and behavioral science and economics, and being able to break them in a full conversational tone, where the point is that you ask yourself questions. So it has around 400 plus Socratic questions. So the aim is to explain a psychological principle using humor and metaphors. Also, we have 48 illustrations by Mark Cicluna, who used to work at Rockstar Games. He worked on Grand Theft Auto 6 Online, Red Dead Redemption. So it's kind of has a bit of a graphic novel aspect to it to make things a bit more fun to read. And then kind of pushing it on the actual reader itself to find their own answers. Because from an author perspective, I don't know who's reading the book. So me giving blanco statements like wake up at 5 a.m, go for a run and have a shower, I have no idea who's reading it. So if you have working night shifts and I'm telling you to go wake up at 5, it's completely not really going to do anything to you as advice. So my approach was, how do I write a book which explains the lies that we can tell ourselves and the illusions, and then make you figure out what your own answers are, rather than me trying to tell you this is how you should look at life, because I have zero idea who's reading the book. And I think it's a disservice that you just go in and give blanco statements. And the whole premise is kind of understanding and kind of approaching like suffering and kind of the struggles that we have in our life in a certain way and things like that. So it's quite of a cool kind of book. I think it's not an easy read in terms of like, it's not a book that you can read it in one go. It's kind of, if I can kind of summarize it, it's therapy meets Fight Club. It's not a book that pats you on the back, let's say it that way.
Okay. What shifts do you expect to reshape iGaming gamification?
So I think first it's personalization. I think making sure that there's 2 parts, right? So usually we have in iGaming, I'm saying personalization from an operator perspective. From a supplier perspective, you never really have enough data to personalize things. So there's not much to personalize there. But from an operator perspective, you have the cold start problem, right? Cold start problem essentially is where when a user just registers, you have absolutely no idea who the user is. You have only a small amount of data regarding where the person's coming from, their age demographic, but pretty much that's it. Now, the problem is when retention is so low in gambling industry, usually you really don't have enough data to know what the player likes because you don't have that much time testing it. Like if we look at, for example, a platform who's really, really good at personalization, as Spotify, they have an insane amount of data across years of what you like and what you listen to. From an operator perspective, this is quite struggling. So it's firstly, how do you get more information about understanding the customer's preferences? This could be done in a variety of ways, but not just personalization on what games are being promoted, but also on what promotional mechanics are being given, how the CRM and the whole experience shifts depending on how the player engages with the product. So I think really having personalization properly embedded into the product life cycle is really, really important, which is kind of what we'll see things being pushed on more long term. And then also software mechanics. So how do we create more mechanics that are kind of varied between one another? It could be that they're running on the same backend mechanism. It's just how they're presented to the user, how the interaction is done, how it's visually kind of presented to the user, what the user has to do, things like that. And that can be different lobby layouts, different kind of game structures or promotional mechanics. I think we'll also see more software mechanics where there isn't really either a reward or the reward is rather small. It's just more how the user interacts with it, the product, which is different. I think there's also going to be quite an interesting one, which comes to multiplayer content. I think that's something I'm really excited to see coming out. So I think there will be kind of new things, but there is some struggles when it comes to regulation being so varied and nothing really balanced, nothing really being done consistent across regulations. So a lot of companies end up kind of scrambling to kind of industry regulations rather than innovation. So hopefully there will be kind of a bit moving away from the cookie cutter approach that we're seeing currently, where a lot of casinos kind of look and feel the same. And that's just from both from a personalization and also kind of the mechanics we're running on top of the content. Yeah, you need to give customers a reason to come to stick to your brand versus going on a different one. Because
Yeah.
if I already use the deposit offer, there is some cashback mechanic or some loyalty mechanic which I don't really fully understand of how you get a reward out of. What's keeping me from making another account on Casino A? And if that is not answered, because ultimately they all have the same games with the same payments, with the same promotional mechanics, drops and wins is across all casinos. So it's not like going in and saying, I am running network wide supplier tournaments is really a USP. It's not, because all of them have it. So what as an operator do you have that you only have and is going to keep me coming back? And that is
Yeah,
before you
exactly.
start going into a bidding war on who's going to give the largest amount of bonus, right?
Yeah. What's one key insight you've learned over the last few years that you wish you'd known at the start of your journey?
Ultimately, I think it boils down to the user experience the customer gets. They don't care about what technology you have on the back. They just care about what they're getting and how it's presented to them. Anything
Okay.
else, how you're managing it, if it's done on an Excel sheet, if it's done or whatever, like they don't care. They don't care about the tech. They care about what do you get and how is it presented to you and the experience. That's the most important part from a customer perspective, right? Ultimately. Or obviously making sure that it's manageable from an operations perspective is really important as well.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, then. That's it. Thank you so much for your time, Matthias.
and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Very welcome.